So there's a lot of talk going on lately about justice, poverty, and the gospel. What if I told you that Christians need to be at the center of this conversation with a redemptive voice, and that a starting point for us should be rally around the thought that poverty isn't permanent, and that although Jesus said, "The poor you will have with you always," he didn't mean that poverty was some incurable disease. Sadly, this is the way some Christians treat the poor, as if they have some unfixable condition. But every day we're seeing poor communities transformed through the power of the gospel. Through acts of effective compassion and enterprising individual initiative, we're seeing the poor literally rise out of poverty on a daily basis. For the past 15 years, I've had the privilege of overseeing a group called Emerge in the city of Detroit. Emerge stands for Evangel Ministries Economic Restoration Group. So I'm a practitioner. And of the many things that we do, like overseeing economic empowerment initiatives, we believe that our top responsibility is to train local leaders on the unique and critical role that the church plays in urban economic renewal and poverty alleviation. Now, growing up poor most of my life helps me to realize that poverty is much more than just a lack of resources or a lack of positive relationships. No, it's much deeper than that. At its core, poverty is a feeling. And that feeling is really hard to describe, but maybe this will help. Have you ever visited a desert before? Now, I know that may seem like a strange question, but I remember the first time I did. It was Death Valley. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Death Valley, it has the nickname Furnace Creek, and it holds the world's record for the highest air temperature in history at 134 degrees. My wife and I were driving from Huntington Beach, California to Las Vegas, Nevada to go and visit family there. I don't like Las Vegas too much. I don't think it's a great place for Christians, but I love my wife, so I went anyway. Now, our friends had told us that driving through Death Valley would be tough, but nothing could quite prepare us for what we would encounter as we drove through the desert that day. I still remember how oppressive the heat was as it reached over 120 degrees and overwhelmed the AC unit for our car. We literally had to turn the air conditioning down because the signs told us that our car might overheat if we didn't. And it seemed like the further we drove into the desert, the more exhausted the engine became. It was like our car was literally becoming more and more sluggish because of the heat. But far more oppressive and far more difficult than the physical conditions of driving through Death Valley that day was the mental impact and side effects of being in the desert. I still remember the feelings of fear and vulnerability and how overwhelmed I felt as I looked for miles and miles to my right and to my left and saw nothing but dirt. No water, no gas stations, no grocery stores, absolutely no place for protection from the elements of the desert. And I will never forget the haunting images of cars that were broken down on the side of the road because their owners didn't quite prepare for what life would be like in Death Valley. And the only thought that kept running through my mind on that day is I got to get me and my family out of here or we might just die in the desert. Now, these feelings of fear and vulnerability and feeling overwhelmed is exactly what the poor feel on a daily basis. They live in a desert and they know it. And it's caused many of them to feel that I have to get me and my family out of this community or we might just die in the desert. Now, this presents a unique challenge to us as Christians because we preach a gospel that tells people that they don't have to relocate in order to experience the blessing and flourishing that comes from being in Christ. In other words, you shouldn't have to change zip codes for the gospel to work for you. So this makes me believe that as Christians, we're called and responsible for casting a different vision for the desert. And the good news is that the Bible has a rich desert theology. Scriptures such as Isaiah chapter 43, verse 19, remind us of the promise of God that he loves those who live in the desert, and he promises that he will cause rivers to flow even in desert conditions. We're called to bring an oasis to those who live in the desert. Now, this thought of calling poor communities deserts is not new. As a matter of fact, it has its origin in 1995 in the UK, when the Department of Health assembled a task force to study the phenomenons of poverty in poor communities. What they discovered about these under-resourced neighborhoods is that they lack the basics: access to fresh food or grocery store retail outlets, healthcare providers and hospitals, and little to no viable employment opportunities. This led those social scientists to label these under-resourced neighborhoods urban deserts. And I get a chance to serve God in the arguably the most severe urban desert in the country, in the city of Detroit. Our historical success and our current demise is broadly publicized in headlines both nationally and internationally. And so this is where I have the privilege of doing ministry. The question that I have often, and maybe you have as well, is how does this type of poverty get created? Not just in third world countries, but right here in the most prosperous land that the world has ever known. Well, the Bible gives us two causal factors for poverty, and we have to take both seriously. On the one hand, Scripture is very clear that poverty is caused by institutional injustice. This is expressed through bad public behavior, through governments and corporations that exploit and oppress the poor. Secondly, the Bible tells us that poverty is caused through bad personal lifestyle decisions, or what we would call individual iniquity. And we have to take both very seriously. And I would argue that any effective ministry to the poor has to take the time to discover what is the primary causal factor for this individual person that I'm working with. Is it institutional iniquity, or is it individual acts of bad behavior? Well, in order to do that, you have to have a relationship, proximity, or closeness to the poor. So I submit to you that any program for poverty alleviation or economic flourishing that is not centered upon discipleship is a failed enterprise before it even begins. Poverty alleviation starts and is built around relationships. Well, the good news is this. Over the past 20 years, there's been a great awakening among those of us who serve in Christian leadership, both in seminaries and local churches. We've awakened to the church's responsibility to respond to the desert conditions in poor communities. And that our response to poverty is not in violation of the gospel, but actually it's in fulfillment of it. And this awakening has led to an even greater and productive movement of calling Christians in our churches and in our seminaries and classrooms to recognize that if they see their work, their occupation as vocation in redemptive ways, that it actually is one of the greatest tools God has given us for loving our neighbors as ourselves. And this causes me to be optimistic. But yet I have to be honest that there are also obstacles that we still face, major obstacles to helping the poor as Christians, as the Church of Jesus Christ. Two of those obstacles are one, the sacred-secular divide. I would argue that the greatest gap in the church is surprisingly not the racial gap or the generational gap or even the income gap, but it's the gap between Sunday and Monday. Sadly, many Christians have not been able to bridge the enormous gulf between work and worship. So this presents to us another great challenge. We have to give them a rich and robust theology of vocational stewardship, helping them to see that God has given us these vocations so that we might love Him as we work faithfully unto His glory, and that we might love our neighbors as ourselves as we work for the good of humanity and generosity. But maybe the second and even greater challenge is the hyperpolarization between strategies on how to effectively help the poor. On the one hand, you have those who take a more parental approach, an extreme liberal approach of big government, massive relief programs as the only effective way of helping the poor. On the other hand, you have those who take an extreme libertarian view of an anti-government, kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach to helping the poor. And in between our extreme polarization, the poor are being lost and dying and suffering emotional and physical exhaustion on a daily basis. I believe the Bible presents to us a more balanced approach. And this is what we've been working on in this beautiful mission field called Detroit for the past 15 years. A more balanced approach that helps the church to realize that we were never called by God to operate in isolation in the desert, but that helping the poor requires us to collaborate effectively with civic organizations and social agencies and even the business community. Now, we call this approach a CDC approach. Now, those who do local church work in urban areas will know CDC stands for Community Development Corporation, but we've used that acronym to describe 3 characteristics that we believe are essential for programs that actually help the poor. The first C in CDC stands for contextualization. That any solution that is going to help the poor can't be a big box solution that is imported from other communities. No, it has to be customized and localized to the unique realities of that local space. The D in CDC stands for data. Our decisions have to go beyond sentimental humanitarianism. It has to be data-driven if we're going to actually help the poor. Our help can't be based off of what feels good to us, but it has to be based off of what works for them. The final C stands for collaboration. Again, this willingness to partner in biblical but yet effective ways with other agencies in order to solve the problems of poverty. So how's this worked in Detroit? I'm glad you asked. There's 3 stories that I'd like to tell you because Detroit has a number of different challenges. We are known for our job challenges, our educational challenges, even our healthcare challenges. So let's start for a moment with education. In 2006, my team and I did research that revealed that of the 60,000 residents in our zip code, 48227, only 11% had a higher ed degree. Further research revealed that the reasons why were affordability and accessibility. And so this led to a partnership with Grace College out of Winona Lake, Indiana. This institution that has over a 100-year history, we invited them in to our campus, to our zip code, to open up an extension site so that they can offer degrees. And you know what we discovered? That when individuals were given access to affordable education, they actually took advantage of it. Grace College brought 2 associate degrees and 1 bachelor's degree right there to our zip code. And 90% of the students that are there are right from the heart of the city of Detroit. And I'm so excited because we this year experienced our first commencement class, our first graduating class. And maybe the lady that embodies this the most is a 64-year-old mother and grandmother named Colleen. For all of her life, she wanted to get her degree, but life kept getting in the way. But because Grace College was in her own backyard, literally in walking distance, and because it was affordable and accessible, not only did Colleen graduate this year, but she was the valedictorian of her class. Secondly is our healthcare crises. In 2004, WebMD released a report that listed the top 20 most obese cities in the country. And surprise, surprise, guess who was number 1? That's right, Detroit. And seeing that America is the fattest country in the world, that means that we were probably the fattest city in the world. And this obesity revealed a deeper healthcare crisis that was unfolding underneath the surface. And we at our church were committed to being a part of a movement for a healthier and thinner Detroit. And so this led to a partnership with our local healthcare department, as well as several hospitals and 2 food banks. We opened up a facility that we call Love Your Body Health and Fitness Center, where we offered education on nutrition, exercise, and weight loss, and fitness opportunities. And we didn't go after individuals who had already had healthy lifestyles. No, we went after people who had never owned a gym membership in their life. People who had spent most of their adult life in obesity and struggling with the effects, the side effects of being overweight and having poor health. Well, the good news is that hundreds of Detroiters have been helped through this program, and that in 2008, we had dropped from number 1 most obese city to number 5. Later on in 2014, Men's Health Journal released a new report that showed Detroit is no longer in the top 10 anymore. We're number 15, and we're proud of it. The fact is that we played a small but significant role in helping to bring about a thinner, more healthier Detroit. But maybe the best story that emerged out of it was that of the manager. Her name is Pat Brooks to be exact. She's my mom. And she had spent most of her life in corporate America, and we had asked her if she would bring her corporate leadership skills to help us to run this facility. And for a while she resisted, not because she didn't want to help her son, but because she was a little bit embarrassed. You see, my mom had spent just about all of her adult life not only overweight, but drastically overweight, over 100 pounds overweight. But finally, she succumbed to my pressure and twisting of the arm, and she did come to lead the facility. But she made this one commitment: if I'm going to lead managerially, I'm going to also participate in the nutrition, exercise, and weight loss programs. Well, the good news is this. Over 12 months, my mom lost over 110 pounds, not through gimmicks, not through games, but through healthy lifestyle decisions. You see, for my mom, poor health was not permanent. For Colleen, educational poverty was not permanent. And this is what happens when the church rallies around this thought, that poverty does not have to be permanent. I wonder what would happen in your communities if the church rallied around this thought. Poverty isn't permanent, and if we took a CDC approach to solving the solutions of the poor, actually contextualizing solutions that are data-driven and collaborative in nature. Well, finally is our job crisis in Detroit. You know, 25% of Detroiters are unemployed, and the real number may be even higher than that. And the way that we went about solving unemployment issues is by seeing ourselves as an employer. And today we have over 25 employees, and in previous seasons even more, and we're proud of that. We believe the church should see herself as an employer in desert communities. But we also hired Detroiters in order to allow them to help other Detroiters. This is when you use indigenous leadership to help local issues get solved. Maybe the most important Detroiter we hired was a man named Aaron. Aaron was a lifelong Detroiter who brought a charismatic and loving personality to our staff, but he also brought an extensive knowledge of the barriers to employment of those who lived in our city. He immediately did research and launched an employability campaign that has received state and local commendations because of our ability to help those who are unemployed chronically get jobs. You see, for Aaron and hundreds of Detroiters, employment poverty was not permanent. Again, I challenge you to take a CDC approach to solving problems within your city, to collaborate with the business community, with civic and local agencies in order to solve the problems of the poor. You know, I believe that God wants the church to operate like Moses did in the desert when he opened up the rock and caused waters to flow. We're supposed to bring the promises of the gospel alive, and we do this through effective acts of compassion and unleashing the enterprising individual spirit of the individual. And if we do this, poor communities will be transformed and the poor will rise out of poverty. Thank you.